The next part of our program will feature an address from former U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico, David Iglesias. Mr. Iglesias is a graduate of Wheaton College and the University of New Mexico School of Law. Since graduating from law school, he has had a dynamic and enviable legal career, beginning with a 3-year stint in the U.S. Navy as an officer in the JAG Corps. For you movie buffs, one of Mr. Iglesias' cases involving the assault of a Marine at the Corps' base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, served as the inspiration for the acclaimed motion picture A Few Good Men. Following his active tenure with the JAG Corps, Mr. Iglesias was New Mexico's Assistant Attorney General in charge of special prosecutions, and later became an Assistant Attorney for Albuquerque, providing legal representation to the city's police officers. In addition, in 1994, he was selected for a prestigious White House fellowship and spent a year as a special assistant to the Secretary of Transportation. This honor was followed by service in a variety of legal capacities in the state of New Mexico, as well as an extremely narrow defeat in a statewide race for New Mexico Attorney General in 1998. In 2001, Mr. Iglesias was appointed U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico and served in that role with distinction until his controversial dismissal in December of 2006, along with 7 other sitting U.S. attorneys. A Justice Department investigation into these unprecedented firings is ongoing, with the greatest attention being devoted to Mr. Iglesias' removal and the issue of whether or not it was politically motivated. He is going to speak to us today about this troubling episode within our system of justice in a talk titled A Prosecutor's Non-negotiables, Independence and Integrity. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. David Iglesias.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown, for that rousing introduction. I will try to keep you all awake. I'll try not to speak too fast. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Yankee land, so sometimes that kind of rubs off on me. I walk fast, I talk fast, I drink too much coffee. But I'll try to slow things down. I have a soft spot in my heart for Georgia because my older sister, Marina, was born in this lovely state, and my mother was actually received 2 years of her education up at the Toccoa Falls Institute way back in the 1940s. But in a very strange quirk of history, 8 years ago to the day, I raised my right hand and I took an oath of office in a brand new federal courthouse that would eventually become named the Pete V. Domenici Courthouse, named after our senior senator who retired after 36 years of service and who, as the story goes, I will tell you more about. I didn't really fully realize the substance of what I was swearing to until years later, when it became abundantly clear that the oath that I took was to the Constitution. It wasn't to my party, it wasn't to my senator, it wasn't to a specific ideology, but it was to the rule of law, something that I've been privileged to speak to foreign nationals in many countries over these past few years. But it was a wonderful day. It was a wonderful 5+ years as New Mexico's chief federal law enforcement official. The ending was not so nice, but we'll talk a little bit about that too, because some good things have actually resulted from that bad set of circumstances. To show you that a liberal arts education is worth something, dénommé, je ne parle français, but this picture captures 1,000 different facts and emotions and circumstances. Because I went from having one of the proudest days of my life, being sworn in as the United States Attorney, to 5.5 short years later, swearing to take an oath also in front of the United States Senate and United States House, joined with some of my colleagues who were there to tell the American people what had happened. The mission of the Justice Department is pretty straightforward. It's to seek just punishment for those guilty of unlawful behavior and ensure fair and impartial administration of justice for all Americans. Now, in that very brief sentence, you have the word just, fair, and impartial in one sentence. It's a good mission. It's something that every U.S. attorney and assistant U.S. attorney takes very seriously when they get sworn in. And I was privileged to swear in 27 assistant U.S. attorneys during my tenure as U.S. attorney. One of my heroes in recent American history is Robert H. Jackson, who was an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He was also a Nuremberg prosecutor, where he prosecuted alleged Nazis for war crimes. And what Jackson said, I actually put in my book, and it's been quoted in numerous other places, because I think it really captures well the obligations of a prosecutor. And in 1940, speaking to U.S. attorneys in Washington, D.C., Justice Jackson said this. He was then the Attorney General. But he said that the prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. His discretion is tremendous. While the prosecutor at his best is one of the most beneficent forces in our society, when he acts from malice or other base motive, he is one of the worst. And I believe the sad saga of the U.S. attorney firing represents some of those base motives. The Supreme Court also weighed in on what the responsibilities of the United States attorney is. In Berger versus United States, a 1935 case, the court wrote, United States attorney's interest, therefore, in a criminal prosecution is not that it shall win a case, but that justice shall be done. He may prosecute with earnestness and vigor. Indeed, he should do that. But while he may strike hard blows, he is not at liberty to strike foul blows. So again, the focus is on justice, on ethical prosecutions. And most recently, there's this really interesting organization with a very unfortunate acronym for a name called NAFUSA. And you'll someday know what NAFUSA is. It stands for the National Association of Former United States Attorneys. They met in Seattle, Washington last week, and their keynote speaker was former Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus, who, as you recall from your American history, was the deputy during Watergate and resigned along with Elliot Richardson when they both refused to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. And here's what Mr. Ruckelshaus said just recently to the former U.S. attorneys. You owe a duty of loyalty to the president that transcends most other duties, save the paramount one owed to the American people. Couldn't agree more. Well, so I got sworn in on a beautiful New Mexico fall day. There was not a cloud in the sky. It was about 75 degrees. I had to pinch myself thinking, how could somebody who was born in Latin America, who has a father who grew up in Latin America, ascend to this important position? I mean, it was the American dream come true. So for the next few years, I couldn't believe that I was actually the U.S. attorney. I did my due diligence immediately before my nomination, and I talked to every former U.S. attorney in New Mexico going back to the Nixon administration. And what they told me, both Democrats and Republicans, was remarkably similar, and that was this. You will be independent. You'll have your own fiefdom. The politicians will leave you alone. This will be the most important job you'll probably ever have. So I took those comments to heart. So for the next 5 years, my office was evaluated twice. Every 3 years, every U.S. Attorney's office gets evaluated. I got very positive evaluations from this team. The judges were happy. The assistant U.S. attorneys were happy. The agency heads were also happy. We were able to prosecute historic political corruption cases, and I later found out through some media reports that I had the fourth most productive office in the country, which surprised me because New Mexico is not a large state, but we do a lot of border prosecutions because of our shared border with the Republic of Mexico. And then on December 7th, 2006, a bright line was drawn in my career. It was a day that I well remembered, being a naval officer and a part-time naval officer at that. It was a sneak attack on my career, I felt, when I got a phone call from the Executive Office of the U.S. Attorneys. And a friend of mine, fortunately, tried to cushion a blow. The director called me and said, "It's time for you to move on. We want to go a different direction." And I asked him, well, what was the problem? Because I knew what my office evaluations were. I had heard rumors, but you always hear rumors. There's always somebody angry at you. As my good friend Bud Cummings says in Little Rock, if you do your job well as a U.S. attorney, you probably won't be welcome at the country club. Bud has a way of capturing things like that. And he says, well, I really don't know, Dave. All I know is it came from on high. So I thought, this really sounds political to me. And I also knew enough about the office to know that U.S. attorneys rarely get fired absent misconduct. So I later found out that 6 other U.S. attorneys got the same phone call I did on Pearl Harbor Day. And we eventually shared notes, compared notes. It didn't happen right away. I was called by the media about 2 weeks later because they were hearing these rumblings, these rumors, and I gave it up. I'm not very good at lying. I guess that comes from being a minister's kid. I've tried, and I'm not very good at it. So I said, yeah, I've been asked to resign. So I was the first to admit it. And then Bud Cummings in Little Rock followed suit shortly thereafter. And then in late December, I get this very cryptic email from John McKay, who was the U.S. Attorney in Seattle, Washington. And he said he was leaving, but he didn't say what he was doing. And it's traditional when you leave the office, you send a message out to your colleagues and you indicate where you're going. You're going to be a judge or professor or some other important job. And John didn't say where he was going, so something just told me that John got the same phone call I did, because he was known to be a real independent thinker, and he had some great ideas. So I fired off an email and I said, "Did you get the same phone call I did, John?" And John called me and said, "Yes, and I hear there are 10 more," which blew my mind because I knew that something like that had never happened midterm. So I said, "Who are they?" John gave me the names. I started calling people. And he was right for a lot of the people. And I noticed some very troublesome similarities in a lot of the districts that were targeted. A lot had allegations of voter fraud that did not result in prosecutions. Some had public corruption cases that were being investigated or had just been prosecuted. And in my case, the chief complainants were party operatives who viewed the voter fraud issue as the ultimate wedge issue, and that is in an email that has been produced. It's funny, I don't think any U.S. attorney that takes their job seriously views any specific crime as a wedge issue. We view it as a crime that needs to be punished if it's provable. So we quickly started to talk. You know, back in the old days, you only communicated through letters, but now with email and free Skype video conferencing, it's really easy to stay in contact. So we all started to compare notes with each other, the 6 of us, and we realized, to quote the astronauts in the Apollo 13 movie, "Houston, we have a problem." And that problem was, it appeared that we were targeted for exercising independent thought as U.S. attorneys. We agreed to remain silent until there was further evidence of political wrongdoing, or unless the thorny issue of performance came up. Because in a small state like New Mexico and Arkansas and other places, your reputation is really all you have. And if you're tarred and feathered with the allegation that you were an inefficient U.S. attorney or a bad U.S. attorney, that's going to limit your job opportunities. So we kind of kept our peace. This photo is taken from the Washington Post. I won't read you all the comments, but I don't know if you can see it or not, but the comments for virtually all of us are very positive. Dan Bogdan, it said his overall evaluation was very positive. Charlton was well respected. Cummings was very competent and highly regarded. And it goes on and on. I'm happy to tell you that the gentleman to my right, Dan Bogdan, has been re-sworn as the U.S. Attorney for Nevada. So Dan is back on duty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. One of the strangest firings happened early on, in early '06. Todd was a U.S. Attorney in Kansas City. He investigated allegations of voter fraud, could not find any cases he could prosecute, and despite pressure from voter fraud groups, said, I'm not going to prosecute anything. And then his brother, who's a member of Congress, crossed swords with Kit Bond, the senator there from Missouri, and based on that and the lack of finding prosecutable cases, Todd was called in January of '06 and asked to move on. And Todd, fortunately, was on the process of transitioning to the private sector, so it didn't affect him as much. But Todd was actually called to testify in front of Congress after the 6 of us did, because as a result of the production that the Justice Department did to the House and Senate, they found that Todd was really an early victim of a political hit. You know, if you talk to Todd, he's a great guy. He's a cancer survivor. He looks really young, and he is young. But I think him going through that experience of being a cancer survivor really put everything into perspective, because he's moved on and he's doing well there in Kansas City. But he is part of our very small group of fired U.S. attorneys that still maintain contact on a regular basis. So my life changed clearly on Pearl Harbor Day, but the stage had been set months earlier. And in October of 2006, which is mid-year elections, I got a phone call from this gentleman here, Senator Pete Domenici, who would help sponsor me to get my appointment. When I ran for Attorney General in 1998, he helped me a lot. He lent me one of his staffers. He did some fundraisers for me. But when he called me in October, it wasn't a good phone call. Because he called me 2 weeks after Heather Wilson, who was my congresswoman from Albuquerque, had called. I was in Washington, D.C., attending some Justice Department meetings. I get a phone call from Heather Wilson, and she wanted to know about sealed indictments. Well, they're sealed for a reason. And even though she's a Rhodes Scholar, I had to kind of explain, you know, what a sealed indictment meant. And I didn't hope, no Rhodes Scholars here. I have a lot of friends who are Rhodes Scholars, so I have a lot of respect for the program. But Heather, I didn't give her what she wanted, because she had heard that I was waiting to unseal until after the election. She was hearing that I was intentionally not filing indictments until after the election. She was locked in a very, very tight race against her opponent, who was then the sitting state attorney general, who had not filed any corruption cases. The issue had come up in the elections that her opponent had not filed any, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had filed all these corruption cases. So I knew what she wanted, and I knew I couldn't play footsie with her. And I need to take you back to the summer of 2001 when John Ashcroft, then the sitting Attorney General, and his deputy, Larry Thompson, who I think has a Georgia connection, said, you can't play politics, Dave. It's good that you ran 3 years ago, but if you're a U.S. attorney, you can't play politics. And if any of you have ever heard Mr. Ashcroft speak. He has a very gravelly voice, and he's like that uncle that you were kind of afraid of when you were a kid. A lot of gravitas. I mean, he's a very serious guy, so I really paid attention, and I found out that that was the same comment he made to all incoming U.S. attorneys, that you don't play politics. So I didn't give Heather Wilson what she wanted, and I'm convinced she picked up the phone and talked to our senior delegate, Pete Domenici, and said, I talked to Iglesias, and he didn't give me what I wanted. So I was at home. I get a phone call. My wife, Cindy, was here, was standing next to me, and he wanted to know if I was going to file those public corruption indictments he'd been reading about before November. Well, what happens in November? First Tuesday is when the election is. And I stammered and stuttered, and I just told him I didn't think so, and which is more than I should have said. I'll give that up right now. And he said, I'm very sorry to hear that, and he hung up on me. And if any of you have ever been kicked in the solar plexus, that's how I felt. I knew something very bad had happened. I tried to go on with my duties, but essentially I had some choices then, because I knew they were both talking about the corruption cases that were widely reported. They wanted me to hurry those in time for Heather Wilson, who was the protege of Pete Domenici, to use those in a political sense, and I knew I couldn't do that. For the very simple reason, the cases weren't ready. I don't remember the California wine company that used to have that ad that says we will sell no wine before it's time. That's true for a criminal case too. You can't indict a case until it's ready, and those cases weren't ready. So I just put faith in the system that I'd be protected from political interference, and I went back to business as usual. So I didn't give confidential information out despite pressure from my friend, the member of Congress, and my sponsor, the senator. There was no voter fraud case filed. I had set up one of only 2 voter fraud task forces in this country. I investigated over 100 allegations of voter fraud. Narrowed it down to one that maybe had some merit. I talked to Maine Justice, to the guru there of election fraud, and we didn't have a good feeling we could prove the case. Local FBI agent didn't disagree, so I didn't file anything. And I later found out through the massive information that was released from Maine Justice to the House and Senate that the local party operatives were extremely angry at me that I didn't file voter fraud cases, especially right before the election. Looking back, I'm glad I did not do that. So we are at this point in early '07. My fellow fired colleagues and I are in frequent contact. And then the tripwire is hit by the former Deputy Paul McNulty, who testified under oath that we had performance-based reasons. And Paul knew better, or should have known better, because he had access to our evaluations and should have known that all but one had very positive evaluations. John McKay got the highest civilian award that the Navy gives for some innovative programs he came up with. And it was all I could do to keep McKay from reaching through the telephone and screaming. He was real upset. I was real upset. And within a few weeks of that, we were called. I had my last press conference. In fact, that photo there is me showing that the numbers of prosecutions had increased under my watch. The conviction rate was higher than the national average. That performance was not the reason. And the senator sent one of his press officers to take notes. So my press officer spotted her and told me. So there was like this dueling press officer thing going. It was well covered. I had already talked to the Washington Post and McClatchy Group and told them that I'd been contacted by 2 members, but I wasn't willing to name them unless I was ordered to. Well, within 48 hours of my last press conference on my last day on the job, my secretary drives to our house. I was the former U.S. Attorney at this point, and hands me a subpoena from the House of Representatives. So we then testified. The House in the morning, and then the Senate in the morning and the House in the afternoon. And I ran into a journalist that I respect, Michael Isikoff from Newsweek, who covers a lot of the Justice Department beat. And I said, Mike, is this very common for Congress, both houses, to hear evidence on the same case on the same day? He goes, no, it almost never happens. So that told me it was very important to get to the bottom of this. So I didn't really realize, my wife is sitting right behind me, and she said that the hair on the back of her neck stood up when we all stood to take our oath. We were all sworn in. She felt like history was being made. I'm afraid to tell you, my feelings were a lot more pedestrian. I didn't want to faint, you know. It was very intimidating to have rows of photographers and C-SPAN there, not to mention looking up at the members of Congress. But we told them what had happened in no uncertain terms, and I was so fortunate that I had other colleagues that were willing to testify. I'm not sure I would have had the courage to have done this by myself, because it would have been my word against lots of very powerful people. But the fallout began rather quickly when Kyle Sampson, the gentleman with the green shirt there, resigned. And Kyle was the aggregator of information. He stepped down. Gonzalez actually lasted quite some time, didn't step down for another year and a half. But his legacy was tarnished as a result of not protecting us from what had happened. Also, there was an ethics investigation launched in the House and Senate. The House did not find any wrongdoing. The Senate issued a punishment. It has a very odd title to it, something like a public partial letter of admonition or something to that, to Senator Pete Domenici. Only time he'd ever had anything like that. I filed an Office of Special Counsel complaint, and then Representative Conyers picked up the baton and has been investigating and just released his report, which I'll get into. The Justice Department has its own Inspector General and Office of Professional Responsibility. They issued almost a 400-page report last fall that has some pretty strong language. And then, very interestingly, there was a civil lawsuit filed between the House of Representatives against former White House officials over this issue. Can a administration official cite executive privilege in refusing to obey a congressional subpoena? Now that is like angels dancing on the head of a pin. The answer, according to Judge Bates, who's a Bush appointee, is no, the House cannot. And that case was appealed. And I just heard from House counsel this last week that the appeal from the Justice Department has been dropped, so I think the matter's been resolved. We had some more resignations in short order in the months after our testimony. Paul McNulty, who hit the tripwire, resigned. Monica Goodling, who famously, there's an email out there that says, we have another Monica problem. I'm not going to go there, folks. But she had the dubious distinction of being the first high-ranking Justice Department official to ever take the Fifth Amendment and wanted a grant of immunity. So when she did testify, it was under a grant of immunity. And of course, Karl Rove there, his name is featured very prominently in a lot of the documents that were produced to the House and Senate. I just saw him on Fox just a week or so ago saying that part of why he was upset with me is I failed to prosecute clear cases of voter fraud. Well, I'm not sure Mr. Rove, who dropped out of college, would know what a clear case of voter fraud would look like if it hit him in the head. And I'll only say this, quoting what the president used to call him, which was turd blossom. Maybe that's a term of affection in Texas, but in New Mexico, that's a bad thing. and I've already covered this. There's a certain irony about this picture because this photo was taken by the Associated Press in January of '06, about the time Todd Graves got his phone call telling him it was time for him to move on. And we're in the Roosevelt room in the West Wing talking about the Patriot Act, which in another twist of history was actually used to put in indefinite interim U.S. attorneys, which skirts the confirmation process, and which I spoke out against, and other members of the bar have also. Little did we know that several of us, because Bud Cummings was in that room also, and Carol Lamb was in that room, that 3 out of the, I think there were 19 of us or so, hand-picked, but 3 out of us were asked to move on within a year of this photo being taken. So we had the Senate letter of admonition. Senator Domenici retired, citing an incurable brain disorder. Heather Wilson ran to take his place and lost in the Republican primary. So those 2 folks are no longer in office. But there have been I've seen the law of unintended consequences, which happens in these things that I would have never foreseen, such as writing a book. I've always wanted to write a book, but never thought I had anything important to say. Well, be careful what you pray for, because sometimes you get it. So I wrote a book and was on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, also with Larry King, Meet the Press with John McKay. I couldn't, I went from having real doubt if we really believed in the rule of law in this country to believing that we really do mean what we say, because I saw the media really expressed a lot of interest in what had happened to us and wanted to cover it. Because for a lot of non-lawyers, what's executive privilege? Why is that important? Why should a prosecutor be independent? The average person has never set foot in a federal courthouse. I mean, we do a lot of prosecutions, but compared with our state and local partners, we just do a fraction. And most Americans will never set foot in the federal courthouse. So they don't really know what's at stake. They don't know the enormous powers that U.S. attorneys have. I believe that U.S. attorneys are the only appointees that can take away your life, your liberty, and your property and do it completely legally. There may be some others that are out there, but not to the extent that U.S. attorneys have. It's a tremendously serious job, and politics have to stay out of it, and we need to get men and women who take their oath to the Constitution very seriously, like we all did. So the OIG OPR report came out. The House committee report was just dropped just 2 months ago. It said that there was petty patronage, political horse trading. The most egregious case of political abuse in the U.S. Attorney Corps was my case. And Mr. Conyer said that when Mr. Iglesias said his firing was a political fragging, he was right. If any of you know what the word frag means, it's a very ugly word. It's used in a combat situation when a senior officer gets killed intentionally by his own troops. It's very ugly. I sent that in an email to a friend of mine, not realizing it was going to get released to a blog, which got picked up by everybody. But the OIG OPR report had similar strong language, claiming that our firings were disingenuous after-the-fact rationalizations, that the process was fundamentally flawed, and recommended a further criminal investigation. And I think this may be the first time in Justice Department history that there's a criminal probe involving the termination of U.S. attorneys. That probe, I know, is still ongoing. It's on the shoulders of Nora Danahy, who's the acting U.S. attorney in Connecticut. And I've talked to her former boss, and he's had some very, very good things to say about Nora as being very diligent, being very thorough, being very professional. So whatever she arrives at, I'm good with. Because the one thing that I don't want folks to say about me is that I second-guessed a U.S. attorney in the way that I was second-guessed. She has full access to the facts that I don't have, and if she wants to go forward with an indictment, that's fine. If she doesn't, that's also fine. because I understand what burden is on her. I just really have a few more slides. I thank you for your kind attention. I'm really looking forward to your questions, because I think this really goes at the heart of what sets America apart. Like many of you, I've had the privilege of traveling officially overseas. I've been to places like the Congo, like Laos, where the rule of law is not practiced. Half of my ancestry is from Latin America that has significant human rights issues and rule of law issues. There are lots of countries where the president can pick up the phone and cause a prosecution to go away or to go forward. And that's not what we stand for in this country. You know, the rule of law is not just a happy phrase that the pundits use on network television. It actually has meaning. And U.S. attorneys find that out very quickly. And law professors get to inculcate that in their students at a very early age. I'll just close this with a few cartoons. And I've got one more slide after that, and then I'm very happy to take your questions. And I'd just like to close this by quoting a Air Force fighter pilot. You know, I'm a Navy man. I don't normally quote Air Force people. But this guy was a real maverick and a real independent thinker. And he raised the roof over lots of programs and got in the face of lots of his superiors. And he just had the best ideas and the best execution. And what Boyd said, and this was a book that Paul Charlton, my fired colleague from Arizona, gave me that I finally got around to reading. And what Boyd said was, when your boss asks you for loyalty, give him integrity. When he asks you for integrity, give him loyalty. In other words, integrity is always on the top of your mind as a public servant. At this point, I'm very happy to take your questions, and thank you for your kind attention, folks. I think there's a microphone set. I think they want to capture on video. If you could go up to the microphone, please. Or I can repeat the question.
Taking as a given that what happened with your removal and the removal of the others in your group was wrong, I'm curious what your thoughts are on when, if ever, it's appropriate for a president to remove a U.S. attorney because the U.S. attorney is not implementing the policy decisions and policies that the president thinks should be implemented, even recognizing that perhaps the president might want more voter fraud cases and the evidence isn't there to justify it.
Right.
So how would you draw the line between what's inappropriate and appropriate in terms of removal, if it's ever removal, for just not carrying out policy initiatives?
How am I going to restate that? Given the fact that U.S. attorneys are presidential appointees, under what circumstances can a president legitimately remove a U.S. attorney for not carrying out the programs of the president? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Okay. What I can say is, let me just take a step back, and one figure I didn't give you because I didn't want to bludgeon you all with numbers is between 1980 and 2005, only 10 U.S. attorneys were removed. That's not very many, and every one was removed for misconduct. Some of the misconduct goes as crazy as the former U.S. attorney in Miami biting the leg of a stripper after losing a big case. I think that's battery. You know, if I remember back, I've seen this video. Another U.S. attorney is angry at a tough question he got after his office lost a big case and grabs the necktie of the reporter. Well, he gets fired too, and I don't remember what district he was from. I don't want you to think that I'm saying that a U.S. attorney can never be removed, because there are cases, clearly misconduct cases. There were some in the Bush administration that were removed, I know for a fact. But you know, I think that's why there is this EARS evaluation, is to measure objectively using career people. Is this U.S. attorney carrying out the objectives of this administration? You know, the deputy is the operations officer for the Justice Department. that deputy needs to get on the phone, because we have to report our numbers on a regular basis to DOJ. And that deputy should, if there's slippage, he or she needs to call the U.S. Attorney and say, you really need to focus more on this. So overall programs, yeah, I think there's a place for that. There's a place for admonishing U.S. attorneys for not carrying out those priorities. But in terms of directing specific cases, I mean, I was fascinated to hear Ramsey Clark say this morning, he never talked about a specific criminal case with President Johnson. I think that's how it should be. I mean, that's the kind of independent AG and U.S. attorney that I think I like. So I hope I answered your question. Any more questions, folks? Sir? The question is, did my successor bring any voter fraud cases? There have actually been two successors. One was an AG appointee and the other was selected by the federal judges. No. And I've been gone almost 3 years now. There's been no voter fraud cases brought. I think the statute's going to be running pretty soon too, so. Yes, ma'am. I am one of the military commission's prosecutors handling Guantanamo prosecutions. So I've been a Navy reservist for 20 years, and I volunteered for activations last fall. So I'm spending most of my time in Washington, D.C., poring over huge amounts of data and trying to figure out how we can fairly prosecute these guys that are being held on Gitmo. There must be more questions to this. Oh, yes, sir.
You mentioned Michael Isikoff, who wrote the book about the Scooter Libby case, and I'm just kind of wondering, you obviously studied this a lot more up close and does as you kind of read the news accounts have, but how does Roe keep getting away with all this stuff? Is he that clean, or is Luskin that good of a lawyer? There must be some explanation.
You know, I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about how that happens. I think a lot of his communications, he was known to be a compulsive BlackBerry user. He had several BlackBerries, different accounts. But I think the really bad stuff was on the private .com account, which was not produced to Congress. The .gov emails were produced, and even there were some things that were very troublesome, like him expressing, I think, Harriet Mier said he was highly agitated that I wasn't bringing voter fraud cases. But that was on a .gov account. I just think he was very good in covering his tracks. I think he's a wily fox and has been able to not be hit. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir.
Is there anything you would do differently? I mean, hindsight's 20/20. You have lots of decisions to make in terms of when to go forward and what to say.
Yes, the biggest thing I would have done differently, and the question is what would I have done differently looking back, is I should have reported those phone calls right away. And I've heard some through the chatter that that would have made me non-fireable had I reported Domenici and Wilson's phone call to Maine Justice. I didn't do that. That was a mistake on my part. That was poor judgment on my part. Now, that being said, Paul Charlton did receive a similar phone call. Former Congressman Rick Renzi was being investigated in Arizona, and his press officer called Charlton's press officer and wanted to know if his boss was being investigated, which is absolutely forbidden to answer that question. Charlton reported that, and it was buried. So DOJ did not report that contact initially to Congress, and Charlton got fired anyway. So I think I would have probably still got fired, but I think I would have been less fireable. Yes, sir.
What should be the consequence for an inappropriate removal? I mean, I know that the investigation really seems to relate to testimony and possible lying under oath, but in terms of actually removing for an improper reason, is there a penalty out there? Is there any sort of punishment that could be meted out against the individuals who made the decision?
I'm not sure. I mean, there may be some civil remedies, although I've got a lot of friends who are employment lawyers. So you can probably see where I'm going with this, who have been trying to talk to me for the past 3 years to to sue and, get a recovery and all that. I'm just not sure I have that in me. Some people would. But, I mean, what I'd like is a public apology. And I think my colleagues would also. There to be no question that we were removed for improper reasons. And I don't think this administration or future administrations will ever go down this path again. I mean, they obtained their short-term goal, which is to get us out, but it came at a very high cost. Well, that's a very good question, Lonnie. I'll have to chew on that one for a while. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Heracles, and I think international law destroyed my country. I want to raise a case against this law. Can I do that?
Question is, any international lawyers, the question is, I think you said you're from Iraq, and international law ruined her country. Is there any way she can challenge that? I'm not an international lawyer, ma'am, so maybe one of these fine lawyers here can talk to you after that. Yes, Erica? Good.
Given that it would become, or it is so difficult to get rid of a U.S. attorney, except for cases of misconduct, what do you think should go into the selection process? Because it seems to me that there's a lot of politics that goes on with the selection as well.
Right. One of the things that you can do is what some districts do and set up a selection board, and they select prominent attorneys from both the civil and criminal side to help recommend a list that goes to the senator that then goes on to the White House. In my case, I had lunch at a Mexican restaurant with Pete Domenici, and that was my interview. So, and then I later found out I was the only one that went to the main justice to talk to Ashcroft and Thompson. So I guess that was a process, but it didn't compare favorably with some of the prior administrations who had really taken that. I mean, I don't think there's any way you can completely remove the political process from the selection, because it is a constitutional job. I heard Ramsey Clark saying earlier, I think it was last night, that maybe you change the law so we're not confirmed by the Senate, they're picked by the AG. So that was kind of his thought. But the AG is not going to know people in all 93 districts, so he or she's going to have to rely on recommendations. My thought about the political nature is, yeah, I came in through the political process. I was and am a Republican. I went through my Republican chain of command, so to speak, but I knew once I was in office that I couldn't play politics. So similar to the federal judges, you're prohibited from playing politics, but you get in there through the political process. But I'm a big advocate of selection boards. Yes, sir.
Has this political dynamic showed up in your Navy career? Have you been told that you're not going to be applied for the next promotion board, or are they leaving you alone now?
Okay, the question is, what about in my Navy career has this political dynamic shown up? I'll find out in 3 years when I'm up for Admiral. I just say that in partial jest. The Navy's been remarkably supportive from day one. Both from the sailors all the way up to the admirals, they've been very supportive. And a lot of the admirals of all the branches, not just the Navy, but were very public in testifying about law of war issues related to Guantanamo, related to torture. And I need to give you a disclaimer right now, since I am back on active duty. These are my private thoughts. This is not the official position of the Navy JAG Corps. But the heads of the JAG Corps were very forceful in keeping independent from the White House or from the House or Senate. That's been the history of the JAG Corps, is to give honest broker advice, even though your client may not want to hear it. And that's a culture that I cut my teeth on. So I've been very, very happy with the response by the Armed Service JAG leaders. Any other questions, folks? All right, thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking